So, hello everybody. I would like to welcome you on behalf of Leipzig University Library to a talk by Professor Kathryn Rudy from St. Andrews. Kathryn, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay. A very warm welcome to Leipzig University Library. We are very happy to have you here and to be able to listen to your talk. That is the University Library of Leipzig as part of a project which we do in collaboration with the Institute for Philosophy at Braunschweig University and the German collection of microorganisms and cell cultures. This project is entitled Contamination and Legibility of the World, Articulating Microbes in Collections. And we will open an online exhibition shortly, I think in May, with the title, The Contaminated Library, Microbes in Book Culture. And you get our interest in having a very close look at manuscripts from the point of view of nature and the point of view of users. And that's exactly what you are famous for, your forensic approach to the medieval book culture. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk because you have published extensively about what usage does to books and how one investigates this. It's very interesting to hear you talk about the different methods and means, and I hope that we will have a discussion after your talk in the form of, your talk will have the form of a video of 30 minutes, and then we will go on and have a discussion together. So I welcome you again at Leipzig, so to speak, and open the floor now and would like to have Carolina start the video.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kate Rudy, Professor of Art History at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and Excellence Initiative Professor at Radboud University in Nijmegen. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you at the Universitätsbibliothek in Leipzig in connection with the project Contamination and Legibility of the World, Articulating Microbes in Collections, funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Germany. I'm also grateful to the Leverhulme for funding some of this work. In my talk today, I will discuss how certain photography techniques can help to provide insight into how medieval manuscripts were used by their original audiences. Now, let's begin with an unexpected example and in a new place that you weren't thinking about: Shire horses. In the last few years, we have experienced an animal turn in the humanities. Here I'm showing you animals turning, but I'm also showing you the Shire Horse Stud Book with stallions and mares that was produced in 1 volume per year in Britain that listed all of the Shire horses in the country. Now, this is interesting as we pan out. This is the set of volumes that are in Cambridge University Library. And what you can see as we pan out and also look at the next row of volumes on the next shelf is something quite interesting. We can tell that from 1902, when the volumes were started, to 1936, when the final volume appeared, that something quite significant took place, namely that the number of Shire horses declined considerably. And this must, of course, be due to the fact that horses became less important as cars, automobiles, and tractors that were petrol-fueled took their place on farms and on streets across Britain. But even without opening one of these volumes, we can sense something, we can perceive something of value and importance, namely this decline over time. And we can refer to that idea as indirect measurement. So we're measuring horse populations, but without even opening these books. Now, a different approach to indirect measurement appears in this photograph. This is a picture I took in Marseille while I was waiting to cross at the zebra crossing. And I want to point out that there's a pylon here with a knob on top that's been painted, and the top of that knob has been rubbed nearly clean so that it's down to bare metal. We see several layers of paint on that knob. And the reason that that has been rubbed is clear when we look across the street and see that there's a cyclist there. And this is the knob that cyclists hold onto when they're waiting for the light to change so that they can not have to put their foot down and then cross traffic as soon as it's safe to do so. And so we can say that the degree of wear of the paint on these knobs across Marseille is an index of bicycle usage in these areas. So this disintegration of the paint or the abrasion of the paint from the surface is an index of that kind of use. Now, I want to take that idea and carry it to the other realm that I'm interested in today, which is that of late medieval manuscripts. Here I'm showing you a liturgical manuscript that has a calendar in it, as well as sung components. And I want to suggest that unconventional photography can help to underscore and to reveal some of the aspects of wear, and that wear can give us clues and insights into how the manuscript was used by its original audience. And so unconventional photography is our first form of knowledge production that I want to talk about in this presentation. Now, the unconventional photography in this case is simply photographing the manuscript with my own hand in the picture. And don't worry, don't gasp. I'm not actually touching the manuscript in this photograph. I'm not making any contact with my skin or my sweater in the page. But the presence of my hand provides a couple of things. It provides a sense of scale, so suddenly we can be aware of the quite large size of this manuscript that's nearly being handled by me. And second of all, we can imagine that my hand stands as a proxy for hands in the past that have interacted with the book. And in particular, the scale of my fingers is of the scale of the very large initial there on the page. And you can see that initial has been touched repeatedly. And I want to suggest that the choir master who would have led the choir in singing from this book may have performed a ritual action, namely reaching into the book, possibly with a wet finger, and touching the initial as if guiding the visual attention of the choir to the first letter, to the first note, to the first bit of the song that they're about to sing in unison. And that this gesture would have brought the breath of the choir master and of the choir into the book and made a physical connection with the text itself. For, of course, in this era, there's a strong idea that the word is flesh, and that the word of God and that sacred texts have a physicality that's connected to their antecedents. So here we can see how the simple presence of the hand here can underscore the original rituals of this particular manuscript. Now, there's another area of wear at the bottom half of this book, and here's a detail of that, where the three figures in the decorative marginal area have also been touched. And a photograph of my hand again can show that the scale of this damage is, of course, exactly the scale of the human hand that's been reaching in order perhaps to touch the figures as if, again, making contact with the figures from the past. Furthermore, the corner of the parchment has been replaced, which is why it's so clean. It was most certainly replaced as a conservation effort because the previous parchment had been so rubbed, tattered, and touched. And we can see just how rubbed, tattered, and touched the parchment is deeper into the manuscript, where the back of one of these repairs is visible here. And we suddenly can sense the degree to which the users of this book, or the choir master who is turning the pages, is gripping so with perhaps a quite dirty hand, quite a wet hand, and grasping it quickly in order to read continuously without losing his page. And this has a detrimental effect on the decoration and on the parchment substrate as a whole. And we can call this inadvertent damage. And I want to make a distinction between the inadvertent damage of simply turning the page with the targeted damage onto the initials, such as this one, showing David playing his harp, where David's face has been targeted with by a particular hand, and also his harp, as if the user has reached in and wanted to make contact with the most salient part of that figurative image, which of course is the face of the depicted one. I'd like to turn now to a primitive choir breviary made in the last quarter of the 13th century in Provence. It has been so vigorously handled that the acid, moisture, and contact with the user has caused the lower corner of the book to become friable and disintegrate. But photographing it simply with a white paper behind the folio reveals the extent of this handling damage. Moreover, a whole section of the manuscript from folios 83 to 91 has these corners that are damaged and have been cut away and new ones pasted on. A medieval scribe has rewritten the text onto those corners in a retardataire script to try to match the rest of the page. But even this replacement was so vigorously handled that it degraded, yellowed, and became brittle with moisture damage. Moisture from sweaty hands, that is. I imagine the person handling this book to have been somebody nervous with wet, clammy hands and gripped the manuscript with both fists. And we can see from this repair that the original damage was in fact medieval. And again, photographing it against white paper is highly revelatory. Very simple, but extremely useful. In the modern era, the manuscript was owned by John Thomas Paine, a London bookseller, and then sold at Sotheby's on the 30th of April, 1857. Someone, possibly Mr. Paine, guillotined the book block and then gilded its edges before rebinding the volume in an attempt to mask the extensive wear and discoloration. Whereas a photo of the manuscript's front cover reveals nothing of its history, a view from an oblique angle can tell a story of this manuscript's damage and its attempted cover-up. For quite a different history of damage and use, I'd like to now turn to the prayer book of Philip the Good. You see in this miniature an image that shows Philip the Good, who is the man in black, kneeling at his prie-dieu and contemplating a diptych that is hanging on the wall. In this tent, which has been erected inside a church so that he can have private mass said, that is both publicly on display, but also private in a sense. So behind these curtains, with his whole retinue in residence and watching nearby. Now, the book from which he is praying is his prayer book that he traveled all over his terrain with, and that was the so-called prayer book of Philip the Good, which had actually belonged to his grandfather, Philip the Bold. And I'm showing you two commercially made photographs of that particular manuscript, two folios that show additions that he made, that Philip the Good made, to this manuscript. And you can see right off the bat that it's extremely worn and grotty. Philip used his book daily, and I want to suggest that he touched it and handled it in a really vigorous and quite specific way. And I think that way that he touched the manuscript comes out even more fully, not in the commercially prepared photographs, but rather in my handheld photographs, such as this. For one, because we get my hand again in the image for a sense of scale and the sense of the book having an embodied relationship, or the person having an embodied relationship with the manuscript. But secondly, because seeing it this way allows one to imagine how the Duke must have put his entire face into the book in order to give the grime this diffuse quality. And also, whereas the hand, and especially the wet finger, tends to smear paint and to make the edges more diffuse, this grime hasn't done that at all. It's left a greasy grime that doesn't liquefy the water-soluble paints and inks. And so I propose that to achieve this kind of grime, the Duke may have buried his head in this opening, placed his own face and forehead in Mary's lap, or perhaps even pressed this opening against a particularly soiled body part. So the prayers rubric, which quite interestingly is prayers to the Blessed Virgin Mary against temptations of the flesh. And here he is pressing his own flesh against the image of the Virgin, who is shown with her bare breast suckling the Christ child. And so he's responded to this flesh on flesh by adding his own flesh to the mix. Now, furthermore, another very specific photograph that I've made handheld, as you can see, reveals that this image of the Virgin Mary is actually on quite thin parchment. It was one of the added leaves that he contributed to his book after he got it in the 1450s. And you can see that he has sewn a large number of objects, round objects, to the page. And these were probably Eucharist wafer badges that put the body of Christ back onto the page, as it were. And these have made offsets on the facing page. You can see the round forms there. And there are holes that correspond to the needle stitching holes where these badges were attached to the flimsy parchment image of the Virgin. But seeing as this was such a flimsy page, somebody has backed it, added another folio behind it, and attached these together. And that folio, you see, has separated, that laminate has separated. But it was originally there to help buttress this. So a photograph like this can again show us a fuller picture of how the Duke used the book, how he made adjustments in the process of using it, that is, adding these badges and then adding a reinforcement and then sticking his whole face into the book. And two further folios in the Duke's manuscript show these added images of the Vera icon, the Veronica, where they're either full-page images that have been sewn into the binding, as on the right, or smaller pictures that are on independent pieces of parchment that have been added to the book with the needle and thread. And again, what's really more interesting, a more interesting way to view these is with handheld amateur photographs that show the entire opening, and therefore can demonstrate once again that the Duke has severely soiled this entire opening, quite possibly by putting his face in order to kiss the image of Christ, which he obviously collected and therefore esteemed highly and venerated. Furthermore, a kind of photograph that's rarely, if ever, shown in regular publications is something like this, which in effect shows a blank opening. But this is the next opening from this one is this, and it reveals the stitches, the waxed linen threads that have been used to stitch these images onto the page in the 15th century already. And it's quite telling, I think, that the facial dirt from this side of the page, which is lipidinous, oily, and has leaked through the oily parchment, and we see that facial dirt coming through all the way on the other side of the parchment. Similarly, with this opening, where the Duke has again added a full-page image of the Veronica, and this one he has also kissed quite heavily. And what you will, of course, have noticed is not just the discoloration on the page, where the white towel, for example, that Veronica is holding up has become brown with this facial oil, but that the face of Christ itself, in several instances, has been severely scraped down. And I believe that the Duke scraped these images himself. And once we see these images in the context of the degree of physical attention he gave them, I want to offer one scenario that is consistent with the patterns of dirt and wear in this manuscript. Namely, that after 17 years of intense oral contact with images of the face of Christ sewn into this book that he received in 1450, Philip the Good lay on his deathbed in 1467 with pneumonia, finding it exceedingly difficult to breathe. As his health weakened and his death neared, he abandoned kissing images in his prayer book. But in a last-ditch effort to comfort the Duke, his valet scraped two of the Duke's most beloved images from his favorite prayer book and placed the flakes of paint into the Duke's mouth so he could ingest the very substance of his beloved images. Now, I'm not entirely sure that this is correct. However, it is consistent with the veneration of these images, with the marks of wear, and with what we know about people's ingesting of images, especially images that also had icon quality, or rather icon status, images that were both iconic and images. Now, I'd like to think about iconoclasm for a moment. When book users attack a figure, they often target the eyes. However, in this manuscript, the damage, accordingly, is not iconoclasm, but rather its opposite: intense love for an image and a wish to incorporate the very substance of the image into one's own body. However, to think about attacking images, I want to turn to another photographic technique, namely backlighting. Now, to do that, let us look at this 10th century hagiographic manuscript that contains a number of different texts, including an illustrated Passion of St. Agatha. It has, as you can see here, a series of narrative illustrations at the bottom margin. Now, this is the recto and verso of the same folio, folio 67. Now, the scene on the right shows Agatha resisting corruption at a brothel, where a brothel manager named Aphrodisia and her 9 daughters are trying to physically pull Agatha into a brothel. Agatha is labeled and is the only figure with a halo. Now, the commercial photos I'm showing you only reveal part of the story, however. backlighted photos show some fascinating damage to this image. Namely, the book users have attacked Aphrodisia and her 9 daughters, and they've done so by sticking a sharp instrument into their eyes. Now, by attacking the attackers, users can reverse the narrative, helping the heroic characters to vanquish their enemies. Here's a detailed close-up that really shows that the light is coming through the parchment because the eyes of the baddies, as it were, have been very precisely attacked with a pin or an awl. Now, if this destruction took place in a communal setting during, for example, a public reading at a shrine dedicated to St. Agatha, it suggests that audiences could rally around the lives of the female virgin martyrs, and as a community could together savor the destruction of her enemies. Now, one kind of image that was routinely destroyed in the course of regular use was the crucifixion page in a missal, which a priest would kiss when performing the canon of the Mass. I suspect that such images were removed when they were deemed too damaged to function, which is why there are so many replacement crucifixion pages in missals. And here I'm showing you a 15th century example where the priest was supposed to kiss the osculatory target at the bottom of the page, but he couldn't resist actually letting his lips move up the body of Christ and kiss the entire axis of the crucified one. But he's also kissed the image of the Virgin, and her blue robe has slightly reconstituted, that paint has reconstituted, and it's caused it to glob up a bit. Now, in thinking about damage to missal pages, we can turn to this example, which may in fact be a discarded crucifixion from a missal. And that crucifixion has been removed from the manuscript and preserved separately. This is a German example which dates from about 1425 to 50, and as you can see, it's now separate and glazed. That's the standard image on the left. It's hard to photograph because it's glazed. And then my own photograph with backlighting, and that backlighting shows just how damaged and abraded the folio is. Now, I want to turn to a little book of hours in Brussels to use backlighting in another way. Let us take a look here. So this is one of my favorite manuscripts. It's in the Brussels Royal Library, manuscript 493. And you can see that it's utterly filthy. And the parchment is this extremely thin parchment that's had a waxy finish applied to it, which makes it take the decoration in a particular way. But what I also love about it is that you can see this Annunciation image, one of the only 2 remaining images in the manuscript, is so waxy and so thin that it is nearly translucent. You can see my finger right through the other side. So indeed, using a video can help show that backlighting in a more dynamic way. And with this manuscript, this little book of hours that's in Brussels, manuscript 493, I want to think about not only backlighting, but ask a larger question, which is what items are photographed in the first place? Often what is photographed and reproduced in catalogs or in exhibitions or other kinds of works, even scholarly works, are pristine manuscripts, the most aesthetically pleasing examples, and the dirty, the degraded, the broken, the filthy, the damaged are often left out, even of scholarly journals and books. And so here I'm showing you 4 openings from this same manuscript, which include the 2 remaining full-page miniatures and then a selection of text pages. It's really quite a charming manuscript. It's got the lower left image shows motif that appears in many of the text pages, which is this folded salmon where the fish goes around the corner. Now, I want to introduce another technique to think about how a book of hours in particular, which comprises different texts, almost always a calendar, the Hours of the Virgin, the penitential psalms, and the Vigil of the Dead, which are the core manuscripts in a book of hours, but often contains other texts as well. How a user might interact with those texts differently and at different rates, and have registered his or her use of those texts, which we can then reveal through use-where analysis. And in this simple selection of 4 openings, you can see that Annunciation page at the top left is heavily damaged to the point where it's been repaired. The image with the Gnadenstuhl is quite damaged, quite worn, quite darkened with use. The text page with the folded fish was largely ignored. And the final image, which has the dove in the historiated initial, is also quite worn with use. And using those terms, not very worn and quite worn, I want to apply some photographic techniques to try to get a bigger picture, a broader picture of how the manuscript was used. Namely, by taking all of the images of the manuscript that I've made, simply handheld, and putting them in an array such as this. And any manuscript that's been fully digitized can be arrayed in such a manner, and you can instantly see the section of the manuscript that is the most dark, where the fingerprints at the bottom corners have left their greatest and deepest, darkest marks. And I've bracketed those with a blue-green a frame. And when we take a look at those, here they are in more detail, and you can see that these are the most worn pages in the book, the ones that the owner read with the most frequency. And what's interesting is that this is a prayer to the Virgin Mary, and you can see that the owner's fingerprints are in the book. She or he held it open continuously while using it, because it's an octavo-sized manuscript that would snap shut otherwise. And this person has read this text, which represents the second, third, fourth, and fifth openings here. And at the sixth opening, that's the end of the text, the owner's fingerprints are no longer visible. So that text at the bottom right was not of very much interest to this person. But that the owner of this manuscript cared deeply, spent a lot of time with this prayer to the Virgin Mary, accords with the fact that he or she used this page, used the opening of the Hours of the Virgin with its accompanying image of the Annunciation with such vigor and frequency. Now, with these 5 tools, that is photographing with hands, photographing from unconventional angles, using backlighting, assembling photographic arrays, or shooting in video, I hope that you can use the images themselves to help build arguments about use history. The next step in my own research is to use forensic techniques on deposits in manuscripts to tell even more specific stories of use. But that body of research, which is funded by the Leverhulme, has been on hold for the last year because of the global pandemic. I hope, however, to report to you next year with some findings from that project, which will involve pollen analysis and blood analysis in surgical manuscripts. Thank you very much for listening today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Kate. This was most interesting. I enjoyed it very much. And to all our listeners and viewers, I would like to say, please type in your questions and your comments in the chat column in the YouTube channel. I will transmit them then to our speaker. I would like to start with a simple question. Do you have any idea why books were this dirty? I mean, if it was a private user, didn't he or she wash their hands? Was it a sign of intimacy to have different times of the day where you couldn't have clean hands to be able to touch it? Was there no respect which we would, or is that not the correct question?
That's a wonderful question, Ulrich. Thank you for that. You seem to be speaking from the perspective of someone who has very clean hands and possibly the kind of person who doesn't write in his margins. And I think that the world might be divided into two kinds of people. People like you who keep their books very clean and never really open the binding all the way, never want to crack the soft bound books so that they look very pristine on the shelf, versus people who think of books as being tools, and that the physical object itself is going to be a locus of the kind of relationship that one might have with the book. I happen to be in that latter category, and scrawl all over my books and have multiple copies of them that represent different times of my life. And so I think that that late medieval owners were similar. And one thing I've noticed about late medieval manuscripts, especially prayer books, is that once somebody breaks that membrane of writing in the book, once it's been written in and a little bit damaged, that it invites further wear. And so especially somebody who receives a book secondhand that's already a little mucked up often feels free to continue to add to its markings, to sew in curtains, to sew in badges, either pilgrims badges or else Eucharist wafer badges that might be token having taken the Eucharist, or to put margins in to change the saints in the litany to make them more personalized or amenable, or to even add more prayers to the blank space that's inevitably at the beginnings and ends of choirs or on the fly leaves. And whether people wash their hands is also an interesting question. There seem to be two camps: the people bathed all the time camp and the people bathed once a year camp. But we can see in Memling's portraits, for example, where his sitter's hands are on the parapet, that he often articulates some of the grime under fingernails. So we have a sense that maybe people aren't too terribly clean.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We do have already questions. And
okay, great.
The first one by Dr. Porter. Thanks for the excellent presentation. The examples you gave of specific people known to interact with manuscripts are of men. Do you know of examples where we know women touched manuscripts in this way?
Oh, right. Well, right. In my Dirty Books article, which is nearly 10 years old now, some of the manuscripts that I featured in that seem to have women owners. I think it's often very difficult to determine the gender of the second or third owner. Sometimes manuscripts pass along the distaff line, as it were. I'm just trying to think about specific examples of women's manuscripts. Dot, thank you for that question, Dot. I might have to comb through my notes and get back to you with some actual shelf numbers, which I can't pull out of my out of the air at this particular moment. Dot, are you thinking about anything in particular? We're going to have to be channeled here through Ulrich.
He added to his question, I'm thinking specifically as early books of ours being described as women's books, although I'm not sure if that's still considered to be true.
That is a very interesting question. That many manuscript books of ours are often considered women's books. However, we have all of these famous examples to the contrary, like the Hours of Etienne de Chevalier and the Hours of the various dukes, including Duke of Berry, and And so a lot of the very high profile collectors of books of hours are actually men. And I think we might need to revisit this gendered image of books of hours that gets reiterated in the literature very frequently.
In terms of the examples you gave, would you be able to say if many people had used those books, or was it one person used it many times?
That's a really interesting question. And so I've been working on a book which is provisionally called Touching Skin. And I've tried to divide or try to notice different patterns of use in manuscripts. And I think there are types of manuscripts where multiple people touch one time each. And those include legal manuscripts where individuals are placing a hand in the legal manuscript and sometimes sticking a hand into a page and then actually reading text from a different page. Their hand is making contact with an image that they're not actually looking at while they're reading a text elsewhere in the same book. And that's why there's often a kind of abrasion that takes place when paint and is granulated and pulled outward like that. And that's typical of a kind of oath swearing gesture. So that's multiple people touching the book with a dry hand once each. And we can compare that to a missal that might be used by a priest or bishop regularly, either daily or weekly for masses. And that priest is going to have a set of very specific gestures and repeat them. And that habit of repetition is going to wear a kind of hole on the image in a particular place. So that is a very different pattern of wear, where one person is touching many times versus where many people are touching once.
Okay. I was thinking about, not about manuscripts, I'm not a specialist of manuscripts, but of books used in schools, I mean printed books. And they have the right-hand corner, the lower corner is always very worn because many hands went over this. Yes, we have another question by Professor Karafyllis. Nicole Karafyllis is the philosophy professor in Braunschweig, who's working with us in this project I mentioned at the beginning. And she asks, can you differentiate between facial dirt and other kinds of dirt by photographical means? How specific can you get?
Very wonderful question. And in the case of the Philip the Good images that I just showed, one of the reasons that I postulated that it was facial dirt is because the whole bottom third of the book is dirty, which would be consistent with sort of reaching into the book with one's whole face and up to the chest in a large manuscript, and really digging the face into that opening. And I think one thing that is typical, perhaps, of this kissing gesture is that there's both the grease from the face, from the nose, and from the lunch, but also the breath, which is hydrophobic, and then the breath, which is hydrophilic, and that breath. That hydrophilic breath, so basically watery saliva, reconstitutes water-soluble paint. And so where there is either breath that is deposited with the lips or deposited with the finger that's acting like some kind of a pax between the user and the book going back and forth, that moisture causes the water-soluble paint to be reconstituted. The other thing that causes the paint to be reconstituted is holy water. And so books that are used in rituals that involve priests fleeing holy water, we see some fantastic arrays of splattered paint, sort of Jackson Pollock of the baptism, as it were. And yes, so that is actually to further answer her question. One of the projects that I'll be doing, hopefully in Vienna, with RTI analysis, which is a kind of 3D or topographical photography, looking at the microtopographies of surfaces in order to calculate how rumpled they are. And I'm going to try to measure that rumple. I'm thinking about calling it Rudy's rumple index. And I think that rumple index is a function of not only the thickness of the parchment, because very thick parchment is fairly unrumpleable, and thin parchment is like that 1970s dictionary paper that it sounds like onions, and it responds to moisture in a almost hectic, violent way, and that it's a function of the thickness of the parchment, the treatment of the parchment itself, like that very waxy parchment that I just showed, versus kind of velvety parchment on the other end. We have this sort of spectrum of waxy to velvety, and that the other element that is going to contribute to the microtopography is how much moisture it has accumulated. Manuscripts or parchment that has become very moist and then dried again feels brittle. It's a little like salt cod or bacala, that sort of protein that is almost crunchy. That's a bad sound in a manuscript when it's crunchy. We don't like that.
I have another question from Cecilia Flocco. Cecilia Flocco is a microbiologist, also from Braunschweig, who's working with us. Thank you for the interesting presentation and highlighting the informative power of dirt. Could you comment on the forensic methods you plan to use to complement the photographic survey? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. So with this project, which is unfortunately so on hold, I mean, I suppose the whole world is, so I'll stop apologizing for it because everyone's in the same boat. But yeah, I'll be doing a few kinds of things. So one is the RTI that I just mentioned. The second is pollen analysis. I'm doing that with Eileen Tisdall at Stirling, who's a pollen specialist. And what we're doing is we're vacuuming pollen out of manuscript bindings to see where those manuscripts travel to. And in particular, we're going to look at manuscripts that were made in Western Europe that have texts in them to be recited in the Holy Land. We want to know, did people actually take the books with them to the Holy Land, or were those texts just for mental pilgrimage? And I'm hoping that we can do some tests on those manuscripts, and that this technique could be of interest to other people who are studying books traveling from place to place. We're going to do our test cases at Glasgow, where Bob McLean has very graciously opened his collection. And we'll start with manuscripts that have actually pressed flowers in them. So we know that there's most definitely some pollen. So we can start with the known, and then we can move to some more unknowns. Yeah. So right, the pollen, the RTI. I'm also looking at a very simple thing. I got a little German caliper, a digital caliper, and I'm measuring parchment thickness. Because I think parchment thickness is more or less an index of the craft skill and ability of the parchment maker. And we see that very thin parchment comes from the period around 1200. And as time goes on, we get thicker and thicker parchment to 16th century repairs, where very few parchment makers are still around, and the parchment tends to be kind of thick. And we who work on manuscripts and archives sense this, because you can hear the sound of younger parchment. You can feel it. You can flick it with your fingernail and know that it's younger parchment. But that's hard to transmit into an article or as a piece of evidence for a younger replacement, for example. And so simply by normalizing the use of a microcaliper as a tool for cataloging, I'm hoping that will catch on, and that we'll be able to normalize that, and that also curators won't freak out when they see us using them in the reading rooms.
There's a good question to this point by a PhD candidate at Utrecht Center for Medieval Studies. Her name is Andrea van Leerdam, and she says, "Thank you for this thoroughly enjoyable presentation. It's great that we can use the techniques you described in a very simple way. Unfortunately, there are still quite some institutions that don't allow scholars to publish self-made photos. What do you think we should do about this?"
Wrestle them to the mud. I don't know. lambast them publicly. Let's see, what else? Do it anyway. Write letters to the editor. Ask gently and nicely. Take them to lunch. Keep trying. Write use the internet, write tweets. All of these things help. Actually, fewer and fewer institutions are disallowing this. And so there's definitely a wave toward increasingly open access. I think it's also useful if we as scholars can take the photographs we've made and make them available to others so that we can reduce unnecessary wear and tear on manuscripts and not have to photograph everything n times if we can share our pictures. Yes. I try to always share pictures and send lots of files to all over the world. It's hard to know who's photographed what, but for a while, Oxford, the Bodleian had a very good grassroots campaign to have users put their amateur digital photographs on a particular site on the internet and therefore be able to share them. And I think that builds community, and it's the right thing to do. It's also good if people could please label them fairly well. Yeah, and that makes them more useful because even a bit of metadata goes a long way.
Yes, I especially liked, and I think others did too, that you showed your fingers, that you gave a sense of proportion, and that you showed the way you're making images and investigate. That's very important.
Thank you.
Because usually we try to objectivize the thing and take us out of the picture, which is possibly not telling enough. There is a question by Dr. Macker, the head of our manuscript department. He says, you have talked particularly about manuscripts that were in intensive use by a single person. How do the traces of use differ in manuscripts that were intended for a community and kept in a library? Can you tell from them that there was an instruction to treat the books with special care?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. Thank you so much. So there's a manuscript that I can't wait to go back and look at. It's in Oxford. It's a 12th century manuscript with readings to be read at collation in a monastic setting. And it's been very carefully handled by one person. But what's really interesting about this manuscript is that there are gobs of wax every so often along the margins. And the idea being that the person reading this manuscript aloud during collation would mark his place with wax to say where he had to start reading the next day. And then he scraped the wax off and then we keep reading and then put a new dot of wax. So he was using dots of wax as Post-it notes that were removable. And so they're dotted all along the margins. And so he's just like Post-it notes actually do leave a little residue. His little wax blobs also leave a residue. Yes, indeed. So that's one example. And does the questioner have another example in mind?
Possibly. I would like to add and build on that. You showed us some repairs done already in the Middle Ages. So on the one hand, it's astonishing that books were devotional objects and you could kiss them, or you were invited to kiss them. People would think you would kiss them. And then the page would wear down and until the point where it needed repair. Why weren't bookmakers more prepared for the actual use they invited?
That's a wonderful question. So I think that to some degree they were. And books of hours often leave an ample margin around. Yes. And that margin is there so that can be handled. There's one wonderful manuscript that's in the Royal Library in the Netherlands that Hank Pork and Thijs Pork have written about. I think it's from 1516. And it lists all of the things that you shouldn't do with manuscripts. You shouldn't give them to children. You shouldn't let them chew on them. You shouldn't take them out in the rain. You shouldn't bend them too far backwards. You shouldn't rip out the pages and so forth. So people are definitely aware of these kinds of conservation efforts. Manuscript makers, I think, put those big borders on, perhaps because they were also expecting the books to be rebound and possibly guillotines. My thought is that an original binding, lots of 15th century manuscripts are said to be in original bindings, but actually those bindings are 16th century. And the bindings that they've come down to us in are often their second or possibly third bindings. I think that this kind of motion, I don't know, if you go to IKEA, there's a machine that makes the cabinet door open and close 100,000 times in order to demonstrate that it's really sturdy. But a manuscript, I mean, the binding is made out of leather, and leather is the hinge, and leather gets dry and brittle when it gets dry, and every bit of use creates more brittleness, and they don't last that long. And so heavy use means that that books got rebound. But rebinding was important because that was also an opportunity to put more things in. You could put postcards and extra images and new choirs and new prayers that were in circulation. And so all of those things can be then gathered up and sewn in and produced as a book. So, right, what was the question was about?
The repair of
repairs. And so that's also an opportunity to trim the book as well.
Okay.
And so every subsequent trimming also trims off a layer of dirt.
Okay, there is another question by Andrea van Leerdam. Thank you so much. If there is time, I have another question. The page with the wonderful image of St. Agatha in the brothel with the pierced eyes also seemed to have some vertical sewing or stitches on the right. What happened there?
Oh.
Do you remember?
Do you think you could call me separately and let's look at that together, okay? Or else I'll meet you in Paris and we'll go look at it together. It's in the BNF, and we'll take a look. I have some handheld photographs of that, but yeah, I think we'll have to take that separately because it will help to have the visuals in front of us. So Andrea, can you call me? Just call me after this. I'll be home. I'm always home. I mean, everybody's always home, right?
The kind of I think you called it unusual photography,
yes.
But it's actually an unusual. I mean, it's more than that. It's an unusual look on perspective on things.
Yes.
You treat books as objects in use, and this makes me wonder if you would go so far. Possibly you have written about this. You talked about use history. Is that use history makes books into more than just things to be read or to read. Reading is just one way of approaching a book. So many books are just read. Devotional books are also kissed, for example. Are there other interactions you can think of other than touching by hand or with the lips, what one can do with the books?
Yes, that's a wonderful question and well said, Ulrich. I mean, among things you can do with books, or you can dip them in there's that famous case of using liturgical manuscripts and dipping them in water in order to purify wells for cattle, for example. You can take them with you on journeys. You can one of the things that I've been interested in for some time, and I had a project years ago at the Warburg to work on this, which is amuletic and talismanic texts that are written especially in the front and back covers and the fly leaves of prayer books, and that those would turn the manuscript into something with talismanic protective power. So just carrying it with you would afford you some protection. And I think that's also especially the case in manuscripts that are in Beutel bindings that can hang from your belt and that are designed to go with you all the time. There's a wonderful one in Tilburg as well, where the binding has two little hooks with a chain, so you can hang it like a purse on your arm. Actually, that's an example of a 15th century binding where the manuscript has been severely cut down. It's its second binding. So books that are carried with you to provide this kind of protection. And I think another really important function of the late medieval prayer book is to receive small objects. So that could be curtains, that could be badges, that could be two-dimensional gifts, that could be little prints. that could be memorabilia that connect you with the giver, and or some kind of corporate identity. So an image of, say, Saint Augustine, if you're an Augustinian. So those are all examples of, and also annotating manuscripts, writing your name in them, practicing the alphabet in them, practicing handwriting. And I'm more and more convinced that the function of a lot of filigree is actually to train the hand. And it's related to the kind of handwriting exercises that I had to do as a kid, where you make those circle diagrams, and that the sort of the evenness of your circles helps you to have this very nice handwriting.
Well, I surprised a user in the library getting 2 very voluminous books from the shelf on name theory, and I said, "Well, that's an interesting subject. What do you do there?" And he said, "Well, I don't use the books to read. You see, I'm quite tall. I need them to put my arms on." And I'm actually interested in further times when we have the pressure marks on books.
Yes, yes. That's wonderful. So I'm doing an exhibition at the Bodleian with Emma Smith, the Shakespearean. And it was supposed to open in April, but it'll open in the future. And it's about books and the senses. So the 5 normal ones plus proprioception, like your sense of your body in space. So we're looking at roles, including a role that's designed to wrap around your body, and it's got little holes in it where it's been sewn around the body. But one of the manuscripts in the proprioception section is this giant wonky book that was it fits perfectly in this 19th century chair, and it has sort of 2 bum prints in it. Somebody has sat in it for a really long time. It's a little like that movie Night on Earth, where the taxi driver has to be propped up with phone books. It's too bad we don't have phone books anymore. We have to use manuscripts to prop ourselves up in cars.
That's right. And concerning the books on magic or magical books, we have a large collection of magical books, actually the largest in Germany. Manuscripts from the 18th century, 17th, 18th century. And we did an exhibition on that. I will send you the catalog.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Those are books you use while saying things and dancing around and doing things. Yes.
Oh my God! It sounds like a fun evening.
Okay, there are, as I can see, no more comments or questions. So let me thank you very, very much for this most interesting talk and inspiring presentation. Thank you for having you here in Leipzig, virtual
Thank
Leipzig.
you, Ulrich.